I'd like to ask you each a different question. When you answer it, please repeat the question again. Okay, so the questions I'd like to ask everyone is, Joanna, in your book, Silent Winter, tell us about the chapter called Our Current Trajectory. Andre, you wrote that, there's an article that says cancer is the leading cause of death from disease in children. The number of cancer cases per 100,000 children increased 43% from 1975 to 2018. If you could tell us more about that. Julian, please tell us about the chapter in your book called Poisoning a Planet. Stephanie, is there any scientific evidence that glyphosate and other chemicals are contributing to neurological disorders? And you could explain what a neurological disorder is. Ronnie, you wrote a book called Grassroots Rising, a call to action on climate, farming, food, and a Green New Deal. Please tell us why you wrote this book and what it was about. And Jeffrey, can you tell us, I'm going to list another bunch of comments about GMOs. Please tell me about these comments and if they're accurate. GM foods are strictly tested and regulated for safety. Independent studies confirm that GM foods and crops are safe. The Nicola Review compiled 1,700 plus studies showing that GMs are safe. GM foods are safe to eat. The Seralini 2012 study was bad science and no conclusions could be drawn from it. Many long-term studies show GM is safe. EU research shows GM foods are safe. Those who claim that GM foods are unsafe are being selective with the data, since many other studies show safety. GM foods are safe for human consumption. No one has ever been made ill by GM food. GM-BT insecticidal crops only harm insects and are harmless to animal and people. GM foods are rigorously assessed for their ability to cause allergic reactions. GM animal feed poses no risk to animal or human health, and genetic engineering will deliver more nutritious crops. If you could each comment, repeat your question as best you can, and comment on your question, starting with Joanna.
Okay, so the question was about one of the first chapters in my book, Our Current Trajectory. And what I wanted to do in this particular chapter is to really look at the big picture of where we're heading based on what we're doing now, where we are now. And we're really in kind of a pickle, both we're in an economic system that is causing problems, and we're in a health crisis. If you think about what we've been doing to the environment, that's something that we all notice, that these systems are breaking down in the environment because of the pollution we've introduced, the problems we've introduced. But now we're to the point where the systems within our bodies are breaking down. We are an ecosystem also, and we have introduced pollution and problems that are not only breaking down the environment, but they're breaking down our bodies. And that's the cause of chronic illness, is that pollution. It's breaking down that ecosystem. The saddest part of it is that really the same companies that are producing the toxic chemicals that are polluting the environment, that are undermining the ecosystem, and that are now undermining our bodies and are causing chronic illness, are really the same companies that are selling us the solutions, the chemicals that we need to take in order to maintain our health. Bayer, if you look at Bayer, Monsanto, that is one example, but there's many others, and the consolidation in the industries are showing that that's the case. So if we look out in the future of people becoming, having less energy, having less capacity to be healthy, and relying more now on those same industries to keep them alive, that's not the future we want. We need to turn the ship around, and we need to do that as individuals and as institutions by investing in what we need, not on what's going to give us a 10-fold or 100-fold or more return on investment.
Andre?
I'm a bit better if I unmute. My question is about childhood cancer. I actually wrote a bit about it in my second book, Poisoning Our Children. And why I wanted to feature it is because childhood cancer is increasing. And in that book, one of the studies I gave was published by the International Agency for Research into Cancer, the World Health Organization Cancer Agency, and published in the Lancet Oncology, which is regarded as probably one of the best peer-reviewed journals into cancer studies. And what this showed is in the decade from 2000 to 2010, childhood cancers increased by 13%. And the sad thing about most of these cancers is they tend to be fatal, very fatal. The other point I really wanted to make there, and what I wanted to show in this book, is also in 2010, there was the United States President's Cancer Panel report under President Obama that was put together by over 30 of the world's best cancer specialists. And what they showed is that the 80% of cancers pesticides, chemical, radiation is a whole.
Andre, we're going to come back to you. We're going to let Julian speak. You're freezing. So Julian, why don't you continue? Your question.
Yeah, my question was about the chapter on poisoning a planet. Now, we tended to think for a long, long time about pollution as being something that happens locally, right? It's a Minamata, it's a Bhopal, it's an event, it's a city like the London smog or something like that, a city being poisoned by its own air. But things have changed radically in the last 30 or 40 years. And the major change is that the chemicals have spread out across the entire planet. So the pollution of India and China blows across to North America and blows across to Europe. Chemicals, volatile chemicals, are released, and then they get bound to other particles, and then they get released again. They get carried through the world's oceans. They get carried through wildlife. They get distributed through people. Basically, we are poisoning an entire planet at the moment, and we're affecting every life form on that planet that has access to those chemicals. That's anything on the surface or in the waters of this planet is now being affected. You can find our man-made chemicals on the bottom of the oceans. You can find them in the snows that fall in the Arctic and the Antarctic. Polar bears, for example, contain mercury from the burning of coal for coal-fired power stations and things like that. So these chemicals are cycling constantly. They don't just go away. It's a cumulative thing. This is the point that people don't seem to understand. They think that once you've sprayed an insect or something, that's the end of the story. It's not. The chemical goes on being active for a very long time. And when it ceases to be active in one form, it takes another form, or it combines with another chemical. So you've unleashed a chain of chemical consequences. Let's think for a moment on plastic. I mean, there's been a lot of publicity about the amount of plastic, 8 million tons of plastic being added to the world's oceans every single year. And it all breaks down into tiny little particles. But those particles are not just pieces of plastic, they're also vectors, they're taxis for other chemicals. They're carrying those chemicals around the oceans. They're blowing around in the air. We're finding plastic particles in the meconium. That is the first poo that a baby takes when it comes out of its mother's womb is choked with plastic. Then you look at the same baby again 6 months later after it's been drinking from a plastic bottle, and you find again plastic in its, so the plastic is getting through the mother embryo barrier. It's getting through the blood-brain barrier into all of our brains. Where there've been 3 reports in the last week reporting plastic particles being discovered in human blood. So remember, it's not just the plastic, physical plastic, it's also the poisons that it carries. And this is what I mean about the poisoning of a planet. And it isn't just the industrial chemicals that we produce, it's also the enormous quantity of soil that we release. In the mining industry, for example, the mining industry produces about 17 billion tons of minerals every single year. But to do that, it has to move 300 billion tons of rock and soil and dirt, and that blows around in the air. A lot of it's chemically toxic to people. It affects their breathing and things like that. It goes into the river where it poisons all the fish. So the impact of mining, which has never been properly measured on Earth, at the moment, is colossal. If we keep on mining, we are going to keep on destroying our environment at this phenomenal rate. So it is the big picture of the Earth. And this is what I'm saying. We know about the carbon pollution causing global warming. What we don't know about is the chemical pollution, which is 5 times bigger than the carbon pollution, and the effect that that is having on absolutely everything. And it's time we woke up, because you can't solve a problem unless you understand it.
Should I go next?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So my topic is glyphosate, and the question is whether glyphosate, whether there's evidence in the research literature that glyphosate causes neurological damage and neurological diseases. And I would start with Andre's paper that he did with Nancy Swanson. There were charts in there for dementia, autism, and Parkinson's disease, all of which had showed strong correlation between the rise in those diseases and the rise in glyphosate usage. Now that's just correlation, not causation. Is there a causal mechanism, and are there studies? And the answer is yes. Studies have shown, for example, that glyphosate causes glutamate excitotoxicity in the brain. And so it affects the NMDA receptors and causes them to go on fire. And it's the excitotoxicity because the cell is producing too much glutamate that's destroying the neurons. I think there's a much bigger problem with sulfate. And I talk a lot about that in my book. That's really where I started with autism. I recognized autism was an issue of mismanagement of sulfate, complete wreckage of the whole sulfate system. And this actually has a consequence in the brain of having deficiency in heparan sulfate in the brain ventricles. That's something I zeroed in on early on with autism. And I really think glyphosate's a major player in that problem by virtue of disrupting multiple enzymes and transporters that are involved with the sulfate system. And it's quite interesting to me that there's a new paper out, I think 2020, on autism, showing specifically that these autistic kids had reduced expression of enzymes called sulfotransferases, which are enzymes that take sulfate and stick it onto various carrier molecules, cholesterol sulfate, vitamin D sulfate, various hormone sulfates, and heparan sulfate. Heparan sulfate is super, super important. And this same article showed in the brain of the autistic kids post-mortem, they looked at the pineal gland, and they found the pineal gland had shockingly low expression of heparan sulfotransferase, and they had very low levels of heparan sulfate. And this it has been shown to be connected to autism. Again, post-mortem, looking at autistic brains, seeing the low heparan sulfate in the human brains, also in the mouse studies of mouse autism, consistently very low heparan sulfate in the brain. I think it's a specific feature of autism, and I think it's caused by glyphosate. But I have a whole chapter in my book on glyphosate and neurological disease, not just autism, but also dementia and Parkinson's and all of these others, and even depression.
Ronnie?
Yes, my book, Grassroots Rising, a call to action on food farming and climate and the Green New Deal. Basically, I'm trying to point out that the climate crisis, the health crisis, the environmental crisis, the political crisis, the crisis of spirituality and ethics are all interconnected. And if we want to solve the climate crisis, for example, it looks like we will have a reduction of fossil fuel emissions of approximately 50%, down the road, sooner or later, hopefully in 10 years. The problem is that a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions of 50%, we're still going to climate hell after that. So the question is, how do we get to zero net emissions in 10 years and then go into net negative emissions after that, where we start to draw down the carbon that used to be in the trees and the soil and the plants and is now in the atmosphere and the ocean? How do we get that back where it can do some good instead of being disruptive? So a big part of the problem is that the climate movement still continues to talk as if we're going to eliminate fossil fuels just by the strength of our rhetoric quick enough to solve the problem. We're not. We're going to still be using fossil fuels 20 years from now, 30 years from now. The point is to be using less of them, you know, and what we can do in the meantime, especially as consumers or farmers or activists, is point out that we can draw down from the atmosphere a lot of the excess carbon dioxide, while the methane converts to carbon dioxide also, that's already up there. We can draw down enough and improve our soils, improve our crops, improve our health, improve our treatment of animals, improve the rampant poverty in the rural world, which is half of the world's population, if we'll work together. But the food movement typically has talked more about health than they have talked about, you know, climate stability or environmental health. That needs to stop. The climate movement needs to work in synergy with the food movement. And then we got over here the natural health movement. You know, we got 100 million people in America who buy supplements or visit alternative practitioners, you know, occasionally or regularly, but do they all buy organic food? No. And then we've got 100 million Americans that occasionally or regularly buy organic food, but do they all use holistic medical information, practices, and so on? No. We've got this tremendous division. You know, the people concerned about immigration reform and immigration justice. I mean, why are people leaving Africa for Europe? Why are people leaving Central America and the Caribbean and Mexico for the US? It's because they can't make a living back in their rural communities, you know, and we have to connect the issues, break down the walls, break down the silos. But as I argue, we also cannot just focus on the negative. We have to point out the positive solutions that we can all start doing today, you know, and we can regenerate our food, our soil. We can regenerate our health to some extent. We can get healthier than we were before, not just ward off all the toxins, but it's possible to get healthy. I mean, I'm 75 years old. I have never been to the doctor, you know, except for broken arms, you know, but one thing I've done is eat organic food and fight the fight, you know, so I don't wake up depressed that we're not going to win. For some reason, I think we are going to win, but it is going to be a grassroots rising globally, not just in one country. The people in Russia, China, Iran, the US, Europe, all the grassroots people feel very similarly that they don't like their governments. They don't like rich people dictating what we do. And they would like to be healthy and happy, and for their children and grandchildren to be healthy and happy, you know, and that's our basis for a global rising. And I think we're going to see it in the next decade start developing.
I was asked about the health and safety and regulation of GMOs, and also some of the researchers that the biotech industry claims have come to incorrect conclusions. To answer that question, I wrote a book, Seeds of Deception, and then I wrote the book Genetic Roulette, and then I created the movie Secret Ingredients and 3 other movies, and I'm not going to get to the full answer here. I will say that the scientists at the FDA were very concerned about GMOs. Their consensus was that they were different and dangerous and needed to be tested. The policy at the FDA says they're no different, they're not dangerous, and they don't need to be tested. The policy was written by Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, later Monsanto's vice president, later the US Food Czar. We have the documents, the memos from the scientists that were ignored by the policymakers. They predicted that there would be problems, and they have been. When you look now at the converging lines of evidence, it's like a smoking shotgun. You have the animal feeding studies pointing to certain diseases or their precursors. You have clinical reports and self-reports of people getting those diseases or getting better from those diseases when they switch to non-GMO food. You have the same thing from pets and livestock reported by the pet owners, the farmers, and the veterinarians, certain specific set of diseases related to GMOs, and when the animals are switched to non-GMO, they get better. We have the epidemiological charts showing correlation between GMOs and sickness, as well as Roundup sprayed on GMOs. Thank you, Stephanie and Andre, for that. And we now have the actual modes of action in some cases, particularly with Roundup, because more research is done. Roundup is sprayed on most GMOs. We can see and track which particular mode of action might lead to what particular disease. So there's plenty of evidence, but there's a juggernaut of an industrial disinformation campaign. If we go back to Dr. Arpad Pusztai, a beloved researcher who passed away in December, he was given a $3 million grant by the UK government to figure out how to test for the safety of GMOs. And in his own research, he discovered that GMOs are inherently dangerous. The process itself caused potentially precancerous cell growth in the digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, and damaged immune system in rats in just 10 days. When he went public with his concerns, he was fired from his job after 35 years and silenced with threats of a lawsuit. I asked him in preparation for my book, Seeds of Deception, what was the most shocking moment in the whole affair? I thought I'd lead the book with that. And it wasn't being fired from his job or discovering the health problems with the rats. It was months earlier when he read the actual safety studies used by the biotech industry to get their products approved in the UK. He said it was a turning point in his life. He said, you know what bad science is. You know it was poor science. It was so flimsy, so superficial. And I used his help and others to point out and catch red-handed how the biotech industry rigs their research and then broadly proclaims safety based on junk science. Really, absolutely red-handed, where they use the wrong detection method, the wrong statistics, the wrong controls, everything. And yet they try to claim the high ground. When Seralini, a French toxicologist, put Monsanto's study that was done for 90 days, he extended that study for 2 years and discovered multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. And the echo chamber of Monsanto's organizations and scientists said, oh, you used the wrong rats. He used the same rats that Monsanto did. You have the wrong size of control group. He used the same size that Monsanto did. And they landed on saying, well, your control group only had 30% tumors, but your experimental group had 80%. In all the other research that we do, the controls have 80%. So if you compared it to our controls, there was no problem. Well, he used organic feed. They all used rat chow and mouse chow. He studied it and found it was all contaminated with GMOs and Roundup. So here's how they compare GMOs with non-GMOs. They feed rats GMOs and Roundup and compare it to rats that are fed GMOs and Roundup. It's a completely rigged game. But their attack was so significant. They paid a lot of money to the editor of the article, of the journal where the article was done, and he retracted the study later after being paid $400 an hour as a consultant with completely bizarre reasoning that was attacked immediately by proper independent scientists as being inappropriate. So I've been tracking this for years and reporting on it. There's no way that they can come to these many studies show that GMOs are safe, because they're not, and we have demonstrated that. We always win the debates. It's right there. It's just a question of now who has the bigger megaphone. They have more money, but thanks to some of the people here and working on it for decades, 51% of the US population, 48% worldwide, believe GMO foods are not safe. And that is true. So in spite of their billions of dollars and their control over governments, we are winning. And because of that belief among the consumers, many companies are quickly removing GMOs and have for years. So it's a huge success story. And now we have to lock down GMO 2.0.